That was Mike Wendling with that report. He's with me now in the briefing room, and with us, one of the focal points of the alt-right movement mentioned in that last soundbite by Anthony Smith, Milo Yiannopoulos. He's one of the stars of the alt-right scene in the US, but he's British. He writes for the right-wing Anglo-American website Breitbart. Since that interview, he's been kicked off Twitter, but not before amassing around 500,000 followers, which gives you some idea of the scale of what we're talking about. In our New York studio, Cathy Young, who's a columnist and writer, a conservative herself, but definitely not from the alt-right. Milo Yiannopoulos, if I can start with you, how would I judge whether or not the alt-right was actually a thing?
It's interesting because it's the first example, I think, in politics of something that's happened in culture for quite some time. You've had these amorphous, leaderless internet movements of people who like to act anonymously. In a sense, that's sort of your problem and not theirs. They don't care too much about whether journalists can get a handle on them. They see the media in many cases as the bad guys. What these people do represent, however, is a very, very large section of the population. In America, I would say that the pro-Trump and anti-Trump people in the Republican base, it's probably 50-50, maybe even now stretching over to 60-70% Trump. There's a huge overlap in the Venn diagrams between the alt-right and Trump supporters. This is a very significant sea change in conservatism in the West.
How would we judge its impact in that case? Because when a group is amorphous, is largely anonymous, it can make any of the claims that you care to make. And as you quite correctly say, it's very difficult for a journalist like me to judge whether that's actually true.
Well, I think the electoral impact is quite clear. In the UK, the Brexit vote was opposed by pretty much the entire establishment here. Yet, despite all of that hectoring, the naturally sort of libertarian, mischievous, dissident, defiant attitude of people who I suppose would be described as the alt-right. I'm not completely persuaded that there is such a thing in the UK yet. But people who may be in the alt-right one day came out. In the US, Trump, whose voters are motivated by many of the same concerns that motivate the alt-right, that is sort of nativism, nationalism, and anti-political correctness, that is a gigantic movement in American politics. Trump is selling out stadiums with tens of thousands of people in them. He is the Republican nominee for president. I mean, what more do you want?
Well, yeah, except that you seem to have lumped together, if you like, a kind of largely internet-based movement with a much more conventional political movement, even if it has people in it.
Oh, no, I was rejecting the definition outright, that the alt-right is an internet-based movement. You see some bits of the alt-right on the internet. The vast majority of the movement consists of people who don't even know the term alt-right. You know, it is a gigantic and very significant new era in conservative politics in the West.
Well, at least no one can accuse you of underclaiming. But one of the aspects of the interesting article that you wrote with Alan Bokhari for Breitbart, you called it an establishment conservative's guide to the alt-right, was essentially this, at best you'd call it playfulness, at worst you'd call it, I suppose, provocations.
Why is provocation so bad?
Provocation isn't so bad, but in and of itself, it is not fundamentally serious. And so the question I wanted to understand was whether or not you were talking about a political movement which to you is serious.
Oh, no, this idea of seriousness is part of the reason people have been turned off politics and turned off mainstream journalists, this sort of high-minded insistence that everything has to be elevated. People like to have fun, and they like to talk about politics in the same terms they talk about things that actually matter to them, like love, sex, death, and money. They like to talk about politics in real terms. Journalists and politicians have forgotten how to do that. And this idea that just because the alt-right likes mischief and fun and dissidence doesn't make them unserious. Actually, it makes them the most serious free speech advocates that we've seen in decades.
Ordinarily, I suspect that most ordinary people talk about death quite seriously, but I'm sure there's a kind of substratum of people who are regarded as essentially funny. But we'll go with the sex. Cathy Young, you're not a knee-jerk liberal, and you've been highly critical of the alt-right movement.
Absolutely, yeah. And I would actually describe myself not as a conservative so much as, I guess, a moderate libertarian, if that's even a thing.
There's not much space on the left for you anymore.
That is very true. But, these days I'm also wondering if there's any space for me on the right. So I am politically homeless, and here I am. I totally agree that we should be able to have fun and, not be serious all the time. But, I would kind of hope that, people's ideas of mischief do not necessarily boil down to sending Auschwitz cartoons to Jews on Twitter. I do think that there is a very real kind of strain of ugliness and bigotry that, is being legitimized here. And, I do know that part of the problem is that the left has kind of made these terms meaningless because, if you can be accused of bigotry for, wearing a sombrero on Halloween because that's cultural appropriation.
Which was what actually happened on an American university campus.
Yes. And, these words kind of lose their meaning. At the same time, if you look at what some of these people have on their Twitter feeds and on their blogs in some cases, many of them have, it's pretty clear, a very serious commitment and interest in anti-Semitic, racist ideas. It's really not just people having a little fun. And this is something that I think is a real problem. I mean,
here's the thing about the internet.
Mike Wendling.
There's a lack of context. So if somebody puts up an offensive image or if an image that somebody may think is offensive, it's really hard to tell whether they're joking or not.
Yes, which is precisely why, although I have a completely different analysis of the situation than Cathy does, ultimately neither of our opinions matter very much because we're incapable of reading other people's minds and determining intention.
So I guess when the average person is coming...
I would question that. If you look at the entirety of a person's Twitter feed, most of the time I think you can tell
Cathy,
if they're joking.
You've done such good reporting on this in the past. I find it so remarkable that you, as somebody who has been one of the foremost defenders of free speech in the press in America, suddenly now, for reasons I can't work out, are drawing a distinction between good provocation and bad provocation.
Milo,
suddenly now.
Milo Yiannopoulos, if I could just interject with a question here which can clarify it in my own mind, because this is very unclear. Now, if I was a Nazi,
yes,
and there are some,
yes,
and I was to send some of this stuff
few.
out to Jews, it's difficult to tell. But if I was, or if I was just a common or garden racist, or if I was somebody who'd had a kind of desire to be more racist than I was actually allowed to be and felt permitted by present circumstances, anonymity to do it,
yes,
what would be the difference between what I sent out to Jews and what your playful people sent out to Jews?
Well, I can tell you the real racists don't speak anything like the people that Cathy thinks are the monsters, right? They are very serious. They are deep into studies and data attempting to prove that certain races are smarter than other races. They are really into this stuff. For the most part, they're really dorky. And let's remember also, a lot of these guys are 17 years old. When they see the right banging on about anti-Semitism, they see no distinction whatsoever between that and feminists banging on about sexism or Black Lives Matter banging on about racism. They correctly see that the majority of the allegations about sexism and racism made by the media are bogus, and because they have no living relatives who were in the Holocaust and have never been educated about why the Jewish thing is different, they see no difference when the right does it with anti-Semitism. And so when journalists with Jewish surnames take the bait and start biting back on Twitter, they make themselves a target for ritual humiliation that has nothing to do with anti-Semitism.
Can I be absolutely clear?
Milo, you know what? I absolutely agree that some of those people are trolling, but as I said, I mean, when you look at some of those Twitter feeds, they absolutely are into these websites that talk about some races being dumber than others. And I mean, they are into this stuff.
So, Milo Yiannopoulos, let's come back to this definitions that you created for the alt-right, because it seemed to me that actually part of the movement that you were talking about was a movement that wanted to embrace new racial theory. That's part of what the part of the movement is.
And therefore, it would very clear to say that it was a tiny fraction. And there are racists on every end of the political spectrum, more racist on the left, actually. I mean, the Black Lives Matter want the same thing the KKK does, segregated dorms at colleges, all that kind of stuff. I really must resist this constant cry for seriousness, because this is precisely why people hate journalists and
politicians. You were just being very serious.
No one here is making a constant cry for seriousness.
My point
actually, hold on. I'm making quite a big cry for seriousness, in fact.
Okay.
No, this being a relatively serious programme, and actually some of these things being relatively serious issues, and something like Black Lives Matter, although doubtless it has deficiencies as a movement, at least it doesn't burn crosses on people's lawns and so on. And wander
it's
around,
worse. They go after their own people.
And have a history of lynching. The equation of the KKK with something like Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter is far worse. They go after their own people. They live black cities in flames because they're so self-destructive.
I have a lot of issues with Black Lives Matter, but I really would not go so far as to equate them with the KKK. I mean, I think there are some people in the movement who do employ, but,
Cathy, you asked us to stay in the present day, and in the present day, the KKK is an irrelevance. It has zero purchase on public life.
Some of the people on the alt-right, I think, are smuggling in white supremacist ideas into the mainstream via the Trump campaign.
Well, what they're resisting, as you know perfectly well, is this sort of constant hatred of the apocryphal straight white male of liberal journalism. What they're saying is that you're constantly telling us white people are the source of all evil, that white people have all this stuff to apologize for. Well, you know what? We're not that bad. We did some pretty good stuff. We did Mozart and Rembrandt and Descartes and Beethoven and Wagner, and we went to the stars. We explored the oceans. We built Western civilization.
Who did?
We're not that bad.
Sorry, who did those
Western
things?
Civilization.
Your we shifted from being white males to being Western civilization.
Yes.
Now, that's an interesting conflation. What I'm seeking to find out is what it is you, if you associate with the alt-right, actually want. In your paper, you talk about the alliance that you can form with what you call natural conservatives, for whom, as you say, culture, not economic efficiency, is the paramount value. But you then go on partially to define it by what it describes as its tribal interests. And you effectively say white society has its own tribal interests, which it is perfectly legitimate for them to place alongside the tribal interests of other tribes. Is that your view?
Can't white people be proud of what white people have done? Well, black people are constantly telling us how proud they are of what black people have done. Women are constantly saying, if the left insists on breaking society up like this, then why can't white guys say, do you know what, we did most of the good stuff in the world?
Cathy Young.
Basically, what Milo is saying here is the left, and I completely agree, by the way, I think the left's obsession with identity politics is really terrible. And so the answer really is to replicate that obsession and to extend it to white people? I mean, that's ridiculous. That's perpetuating the problem.
Of course it isn't. And as I said earlier, obviously...
Sorry, Milo, let Cathy finish.
So what exactly is the case that we're making here for the alt-right? It's going to alienate a lot of reasonable critics of political correctness, who are going to see the anti-PC rebellion as associated with these, white identity people.
Well, if they're stupid enough, to throw out their beliefs about free speech because they think it might be associated with somebody unsavory, then I don't care about them because they're idiots.
I think we're talking about something more serious, though, than that. I'm sorry to use the word serious again. So let's go back again to your own writings about it. You described Donald Trump, for instance, as the first truly cultural candidate since Pat Buchanan.
Yes.
And that's obviously supposed to be a good thing. At least I take it from context.
Yes, I meant it as a compliment.
Yeah. What does it mean?
Many voters in the election in America coming up are not necessarily voting in their own economic interests. And that's not because they're idiots, but it is because they recognize that at this particular moment in history, it might be more important to pay attention to culture than economics. And I think something similar was going on with the Brexit vote. Americans are becoming aware that the American way might be better than everybody else's way. And maybe it's worth insulating it from inferior values and inferior models of how to run a society. America is the best country there has ever been. And there are a lot of Americans who would quite like it to stay that way.
Cathy Young.
The problem is that the alt-right really does tie culture to ethnicity and really does argue that America was created not as this universalist society based on liberal principles, but as a country for white people. I mean, they're pointing to early 18th century laws that reserved citizenship only for white people. This is what they're doing. This is what they're talking about.
But the trollish element of the alt-right does that stuff on Twitter. The trollish element of...
I'm bound to point out to you that there's a contradiction in what you've been saying. And it's a surprising contradiction, really, for, if you like, a kind of half-Greek British gay person in the United States to involve themselves so firmly in what seemed to be, to many people, to be kind of white identity politics from a very old and some people will feel a very dark place.
Well, I'm Jewish too, by the way.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you, doesn't any of this worry you?
No, you are falling into exactly the trap that the alt-right is resisting with its mocking of identitarian politics. You're suggesting that because of what I am, I shouldn't hold certain beliefs. I reject the premise of your question utterly.
I actually absolutely agree. I think that all of us, whatever our identity may happen to be, should oppose bigotry. I don't believe in putting people in boxes. I think that's exactly what the alt-right does. It's really kind of ridiculous to discount all of the ethno-nationalist aspects of their rhetoric.
Don't you think that perhaps the result of the alt-right might be great? And if you don't like Donald Trump and you find him aggressive and obnoxious and irritating and distasteful, the effect of him, smashing political correctness, might be great.
Well, that leads
everybody to realise.
That leads me on to my final question.
Well, then I'll let you do it.
Precisely, which is there anything for the alt-right after Trump?
Of course. Of course, what they've demonstrated is the insanity and absurdity of identity politics. The vast majority of people in this movement believe in principle over ethnicity, freedom of speech, libertarianism, and free intellectual inquiry. If the effect of Trump and the effect of the alt-right is to make the unsayable sayable again, wonderful. I don't know how long the Trump candidacy and or presidency is going to go on, and I think after Trump there will still be some work left to do, and that work will be done not by journalists who ought to have been doing it, but by the alt-right.
Cathy Young, is there any future for the alt-right after Trump, or is this a sort of temporary phenomenon?
The alt-right, it probably is here to stay. I think that we're going to see more polarization. I absolutely reject the idea that the alt-right is the only or even the principal movement that opposes political correctness. So I think that, the alt-right probably after Trump may recede to a more marginal role. But again, I really have no idea what will happen. I think, unfortunately, we're going to see more polarization.
Cathy Young sensibly eschewing prediction. I'm going to eschew prediction too, but I'd like to thank her, Milo Yiannopoulos, and our reporter Mike Wendling for briefing us on the alt-right. And just to sum up, this is what I think we've learned. The alt-right is an alternative movement in the sense that it's a right wing that isn't tied to the political establishment, but it's an amorphous movement rather than a coherent organisation or even a coherent set of ideas. What unites the alt-right, it seems to me, is what it's against: immigration, political correctness, things like that, rather than what it's for. So to go back to the question I asked, is it actually a thing? Yes, I think it is. And thanks to Donald Trump, it's no longer just a subculture. It could become a big, important thing with a leader. Till next week, goodbye.